Australia's former ambassador to Israel also. Dave, good to see you. This must be bringing back some memories for you.
It does, Peter. I was stationed in Israel from 2013 to 2017, and the last major conflict with Gaza, which looks a lot like the one we're seeing on our television screens now, was in the summer of 2014. And look, I remember the air raid sirens going off. I remember going to the bomb shelter. I remember a conflict that lasted well over 50 days, and I visited Gaza a few months after the conflict ended and saw the suffering that had gone on there. It's one of these conflicts where no one really comes out a winner, and certainly the civilians bear the brunt of it on both sides.
So that one lasted 50 days, of course, the 50-day war. How do you see this one ending? Because I mean, it's a cycle. This every couple of years it starts again, and away we go. But is it a matter of Hamas running out of military supplies and rockets, or Israel deciding, well, we've taught enough of a lesson here? And I noticed that the article that you wrote in the Australian today, you mentioned that Hamas feels like it can end once it's given Israel a bloody nose.
Yeah, look, I think Hamas's calculation here is not a conventional one. They don't really care about their own civilian population, and in fact and perversely, civilian casualties on the Gazan side kind of strengthen Hamas's arm in the propaganda and information war. They're the ones that can stop this. I mean, the only reason this conflict is underway is because Hamas was firing rockets, dozens, tens, hundreds overnight at Israeli civilian populations. And of course, no government is going to accept that or tolerate it or just absorb it. Israel is only striking back because Hamas keeps firing the rockets. Now, when does Hamas stop? Well, look, either when they think they've kind of given themselves enough of a propaganda victory to secure their hold on power, or if their leadership and military infrastructure and arsenal becomes so degraded because of Israeli counterstrikes that they start to worry about their own grip on power. And that's really what brought the last conflict to an end. Hamas's arsenal was running low. They'd taken a lot of punishment. They didn't have much more to give, and they thought they'd give it up. Now, where we are now in terms of that calculation within Hamas, it's very difficult to assess.
Can you take us behind the scenes, Dave, given what you know, your experiences and your relationship with the government there while you were there? Are you able to provide our viewers with an understanding or an insight of the decision-making behind the scenes when it comes to Israel and which targets to strike, based on the intelligence that they're getting? What's the thought process behind all of that, bearing in mind that there are so many civilians in what is largely known as the world's largest open-air prison, being Gaza?
Well, it's very difficult for the IDF and Israel to operate because Hamas is embedded in civilian infrastructure in Gaza. There's no separate military installations. There's command posts under hospitals. There's rocket launchers under schools. There's Hamas intelligence posts in civilian hotels, which house media organisations, as we saw just over the weekend. Israel's aim here is really just to stop the rocket fire. They don't want to engage in regime change. Who governs Gaza is really a matter for the Palestinians. And they don't want to go in and reoccupy Gaza. They withdrew from Gaza in 2005 and they've got no desire to go back. So all they want to do here is stop the rocket fire. But they don't have a whole lot of tools to do that. They can attack the sites of rocket launches, which they do frequently. They can attack sites of Hamas military infrastructure and Hamas military personnel. But because Gaza is a very crowded place, we're talking about, roughly 1.5 to 2 million people living in an area that's about 36 square kilometres. It's very hard to do that whilst minimising civilian casualties and civilian loss. It's not like a conventional open-air war. So, look, every day, and there's a huge team of lawyers in the IDF that are versed in the laws of armed conflict. They have to take very difficult decisions each day, as any nation engaged in armed conflict does, a responsible nation, to decide whether they strike a target or not. And often the decision is no. They say, look, we can't risk it. We think there's a family in there. We think there are children there. The collateral damage will be too high. But these are pretty unenviable decisions, and it's caused by the way that Hamas operates, using its civilian population as a shield, effectively.
Well, I mean, I saw that firsthand back in 2014. Hamas militants were operating out of that main Al-Shifa hospital, which is very cunning,
Exactly.
which is a very cunning thing to do. So in that sense, I mean, there was a bit of exposure around the building that housed the media organisations on the weekend that was bombed. AP says that they didn't have any idea that Hamas militants were operating in that building. Do you find that hard to believe, given that Hamas is everywhere?
Look, AP may not have known that to be the case, but they shouldn't be surprised that Hamas was in their building, even if they didn't know. I mean, in the last conflict, you'll remember this. I think it was Al Jazeera had a floor in the building, and they found that a rocket was being fired from the floor underneath them towards Israel. I mean, Hamas is embedded, as you said. The main command post for Hamas in the last war was under the main hospital in Gaza, and Israel knew that it couldn't strike the hospital and it couldn't hit Hamas' senior leadership. They were buried deep in a bunker under the hospital. You could only get to them by destroying the hospital. So I think, look, Israel, obviously, I don't know the ins and outs of that decision, but they would have taken it as a proportionate decision, meaning that the military gain is sufficient to justify it. And of course, in that instance, they gave warnings to the journalists and the other tenants in the building to get out because they were going to strike the building. That obviously gives Hamas a chance to leave the building as well. And this is part of the challenge of conducting an operation in this sort of environment.
Yeah, I remember they send these dummy rockets over sometimes too, the warning rockets that don't actually explode, and that gives people 10, 15 minutes.
Tap on the roof.
That's right, the tap on the roof, yeah. Do you think also, we know Benjamin Netanyahu, he's involved in a caretaker government at the moment of sorts. This strengthens his hand, doesn't it? This is bread and butter for him.
Look, I think what it does is it pushes Israel to fear more for their security. Israelis, and Netanyahu has impeccable security credentials. It had looked like, to be honest, that after the fourth election in 2 years, Netanyahu had been unable to form a government, and it looked like an alternative coalition was going to form. I think this has certainly given Netanyahu a boost to his chances now. The other thing it's done, though, and I think this is really unfortunate, is that Israel was very close to forming a coalition government for the first time in their history involving one of the Arab Israeli parties. Arab Israelis in Israel are about 20% of the population. They've got representation in the Knesset, and this would have been the first time that one of these parties was included in the governing coalition. But unfortunately, what this conflict has done has stoked intercommunal tension between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, and we've seen that in towns like Lod and Beersheba and Haifa, where the populations live very closely. And I think this is going to make the politics of including an Arab political party in the governing coalition now very difficult, and it's going to set back, unfortunately, relations between Israel's Arab population and Israel's Jewish population. And look, Hamas certainly knows this. This is certainly part of their objective, is to exploit some of these seam lines within Israel, and also further afield, to make it harder for the countries that have now conducting open relations with Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, to continue with this normalisation process with Israel, because they're trying to make the politics of that much harder. This is part of their strategic objective here.
Hey Dave, just a quick sidestep here because I've got to go to Laura, but just on international borders, do you believe that we need to rethink on this, that that it does need to be a plan to open up?
Look, I was interested to see the comments of Nick Coatsworth and Brett Sutton over the weekend. We've often been told throughout this crisis, and rightly so, that we should listen to the experts. Well, these guys are public health experts par excellence. And I think, we should always be taking an approach which is evidence-based, that is listening to the experts, which is proportionate. That means that the measures we're taking are linked and commensurate with the risk involved, and reversible, because we've seen with this pandemic that it can take twists and turns that no one can predict. So it's hard to lay out a firm path and say you're going to stick to it. But obviously, I think, like many Australians, want to see us get back to normal life as soon as possible, and that means as a nation that travels and works and has family overseas and that invests overseas and has business overseas, that I'm keen to see our international borders opened as soon as it's safe to do so. And I add that caveat: it needs to be safe, and as I said, it needs to be based on expert advice. But I don't think. I think we need to be always keeping in mind what are the conditions that will allow us to do that. And clearly, high vaccine uptake and everyone getting vaccinated is one important precursor for that.